Hey guys, it's Miss Jotzi. I wish I could see you, but I can't. I wanted to go through some of the last material for this year that I don't know if we're ever going to be together again. So I figured we could finish up the year with our final unit and get you prepared for that AP exam, which I have no idea what that's going to be like, but hopefully I'll be finding out soon. So, anyway, our last unit is called cell energy. And it does incorporate a lot of things we already know. We're just going to get into a couple technical ideas about how it is exactly that cells can obtain and use energy. We kind of have an understanding that ATP is involved, so you're going to hear me talk a lot about that. But first we're going to get into photosynthesis because that's kind of where it all began. And then later on we'll get into cellular respiration. Okay, so to begin, I think you probably know what photosynthesis is. Photo meaning light, synthesis meaning to make. So it's the idea how cells can use the sun's energy to make their own food. And these cells that we're talking about are pretty much all going to be autotrophs. In particular, they're called photoautotrophs. Photo meaning light, autotroph meaning food, are self-feeding, so making their own food with the help of light. And of course, those obviously include plants, that's a given, but also algae. So algae is basically a plant that doesn't have a root, doesn't have roots and stems. So it's like the green stuff that floats on top of ponds. Also included in this mix is something called cyanobacteria, which is a very ancient version of bacteria that we believe were photosynthetic. So we'll talk a little bit about them in just a minute. So our theme here is energy. So photosynthesis actually it requires a little bit of energy to actually build the food for the plant. And that food is going to be a form of sugar that we know pretty well now called glucose. So we're going to go through the process of how they actually make the glucose. There is a bit of chemistry, but I'm going to keep it as chemistry light as I can because I don't think you'll be tested on all those details. And just as an FYI, there are other kinds of autotrophs out there besides the ones that are photoautotrophs. So there's a group called the chemoautotrophs, and chemo just meaning chemical. So these are really, really weird bacteria that probably are pretty ancient in origin. And they use like chemicals that we would consider toxic in their environments, and then they can break down those chemicals and extract the energy out of them. So just keep in mind that the word autotroph isn't always about plants, but most of the time for us it is. Okay, the other thing I want to mention is there's a connection here between where we are right now and then where we're going to be going in our next little set of notes about energy. And that is something that you probably learned about as a kid, like fourth grade science when you finally learned about photosynthesis, I think, because my son just learned about it. And he actually knows a few things, but not much. But they don't use the word cell respiration because I feel like it's just a difficult concept for a little kid to understand. But there's a connection here between plants and animals. Plants doing photosynthesis, you can kind of see in the picture here that plants are going to be producing the oxygen and of course glucose, which is the most basic form of sugar that can then be combined to build everything in a cell pretty much. And then you see mitochondria. We're going to talk a little bit about some misunderstandings about where you find mitochondria, but for us, just keep in mind that, we are heterotrophs, so we only have mitochondria. We can't do photosynthesis. We can only do respiration. So we are dependent upon plants as our source of energy for food. So whether you're eating the plant directly or more likely, eating an animal that ate a plant, you're still impacted by the process of photosynthesis. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that plants, autotrophs, they actually have chloroplasts, of course, for photosynthesis. That's the location where it happens. But they also have mitochondria, the little powerhouse of the cell. So they have both. So they're not, that's kind of one big misconceptions in biology as students, well, I don't want to tell you what students say, but just keep in mind that plants have both mitochondria and chloroplasts, but we only have mitochondria. Okay. And of course, there's always a connection to evolution here. Thinking of origins, tracing it back in time to common ancestry and the timeline of evolution and the fossil record. It is pretty well accepted that Photosynthesis is a little bit older than we'd assume it is, because it actually happened before the evolution of plants, in that group of bacteria I was mentioning earlier called the cyanobacteria. So they are prokaryotes, which means they are like bacteria. They are single-celled, they're small, they don't have a nucleus, they don't have a lot of complex organelles, but there was something in those cells that were allowing them to use the sun's energy to provide their own food. There's some evidence that supports this idea. And we also think that these little cyanobacteria were actually responsible for putting oxygen in the atmosphere. So, prior to their evolution, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. It was kind of a hostile environment. And then because oxygen, by the way, is a waste product in photosynthesis, as these little cyanobacteria were doing that process, they released the oxygen into the atmosphere. Okay, one other thing that's kind of worth mentioning now, I think it might have been brought up in your spring break assignment, if you did that, which you should definitely, is this idea that there's compartmentalization within all cells. So just think of a compartment, okay? So like a little small location where something happens or something is stored. Eukaryotes have evolved organelles that allow the cells to establish the internal environments that are different from the external. So that load of words there is really just saying that organelles are like little tiny locations where very specific cell functions can happen independently of other cell functions. So the cell is just essentially in these little tiny compartments. There's a couple other things just to mention about compartmentalization in general, but I think it kind of just makes sense. There's not much to dwell on here. If you can multitask, that's really what compartmentalization is. You can do two things at once. Maybe those things are connected, maybe they're not, but it's this idea that the cell's really efficient because it can do, things related to cell energy, things related to osmosis diffusion at the same time. So this idea that there are different locations within the cell helps the cell to compartmentalize its processes and just, multitask and be more efficient. Okay, one other thing, not quite related to photosynthesis, but kind of, is this concept called endosymbiosis. So this is kind of one of these overarching themes. It connects evolution again, just like we saw before. Endo meaning within, and symbiosis, hopefully remember from your summer assignment a long time ago. Symbiosis is an ecology idea where you have a relationship between two organisms. Sometimes it's a beneficial relationship. We call that mutualism. Sometimes it's a positive negative. That's like a parasite. And then we have that one in between, commensalism, where an organism benefits and the other one doesn't care. Well, this one is probably more of a mutual relationship, and endo meaning within. So it answers the question, how did eukaryotes come to be? And we are pretty sure that eukaryotes are the result of small bacteria. In this diagram here, we've got a couple different types, cyanobacteria and aerobic bacteria. We'll talk about what aerobic means later. But you had really small bacteria living inside of larger bacteria. And they had a symbiotic relationship together. It became beneficial. It probably was selected for time and time again through natural selection. And then eventually, we think that those little tiny bacteria become what are now called organelles. So the origins of where organelles came from might suggest that they came from these little tiny prokaryotes that lived inside of larger ones. It sounds like fiction, but there's actually quite a bit of evidence that supports this idea of endosymbiosis. And looking at the two main organelles that we're going to discuss in this little unit here, mitochondria and chloroplast, there's a lot of coincidences about the structures and the shapes of them that probably aren't coincidences. Whenever there's a coincidence, it probably just means common ancestry of some type. So first of all, they both have their own ribosomes, which is kind of unusual. They're also separated from the cytoplasmic ribosomes. And the ribosomes are like the same size as ribosomes you would find in a bacteria. So there's your first coincidence. Both mitochondria and chloroplast have their own set of DNA. They actually have their own genes separate from the DNA in the nucleus. And because they have that, they are able to reproduce independently from the rest of the cells. So like when you need to make more mitochondria, the mitochondria then handles its own business. It doesn't really have anything to do with the nucleus at that point. Also, they both have double membranes, and the organelles themselves are about the same size as bacteria. So there's quite a bit of evidence that supports this idea, like where the heck did organelles come from? Well, they might be the remnants of what were once little bacteria living inside larger bacteria. Okay, now on to the actual photosynthesis stuff. So you saw me mention before, you heard me mention before, the concept of a chloroplast. Chloroplast, the word plast is just like this word that means wrapper, like WRAPPER, or like a package that something lives inside, and chloro refers to that green color. So here's a picture of a chloroplast, or the cartoon version. The first thing to note is that it's a double membrane. So there's actually 2 layers of membrane here. And if you remember anything from your osmosis diffusion unit, cell membranes are surface area for a cell. It's space where you can just do more stuff and move things across the membrane. So by having a double membrane, it makes the cell really efficient, and there's going to be a lot of chemistry involved in photosynthesis, so it just makes like more space where you can do more chemistry over time. So that's the first thing to note. Also, the reactions in photosynthesis happen in one of 2 locations. The first are called the thylakoids, and the thylakoids are these little coin-like structures, and you can actually see that there's a bunch of them all stacked up on top of each other. When you stack them up, they become what's called a granum, sometimes called a grana for plural, but that's not really that important. And then you have what's called the stroma, and the stroma is just this fluid. It's the fluid in between the granum. That's going to be the location where we actually build the glucose molecule.